All right, so general information in regard to chapter 13, the cardiovascular system. All right, so our general info. First thing, the study of the heart is called cardiology. And so anytime you see the prefix card, it's going to be referencing the heart. So when we say cardiovascular, we are talking about the heart as well as the vascular system. In addition to that, the heart is our center of circulation and a few other things. It's located in the mediastinum. But more specifically, it's in the pericardial cavity. Remember that? So it's surrounded or covered with what type of pericardium? Is it visceral or is it parietal? What covers the heart?
Oh, visceral.
Visceral pericardium. Is what covers the heart. And parietal pericardium lines the cavity that the heart is in. Okay. So we've got our diagram here, and I'm just going to do my basic diagrammatic representation of what the heart looks like. And a few basic things. The size of it is about the size of a closed fist. Its approximate weight, and this is, this will vary by person, but approximately 300 grams. And in addition to that, it has a base and an apex. Now the thing about it is, when you think of apex, what do you think about? Something being at the top, right? But the apex of the heart actually is not, because an apex is a peak. So the heart itself kind of looks like this. We kind of saw that from the diagram that we just looked at from the dissection tool. And I guess maybe I need to make this a little bit more of a peak like this. So the base of the heart is actually at the top, because the base is the broadest part. So this would be the base, while this peak or the point is the apex. And so you can kind of see, just by this crude diagrammatic representation that I've drawn, we can kind of see how we can create the heart shape that we reference. Okay? And in addition to that, it has 4 chambers. The 2 smaller chambers at the top are called the atria. And atria, plural for atrium. We have a right atrium and we have a left atrium. Looking at the diagram that's on the board, which side would be the right and which side would be the left?
That's the right. That's the one.
Exactly. Remember, always think anatomically. So this would be the right atrium and this would be the left atrium. They are the smaller upper chambers of the heart. Now, there are also lower chambers. The lower chambers are larger and they are called the ventricles. Same rules apply. This would be the right ventricle and this would be the left ventricle of the heart. Those are the 4 chambers. Now, just as we have talked about other organs and various organ systems that have layers, the heart itself has layers as well. So the layers of the heart include the following. The innermost layer is called the endocardium. Once again, that prefix endo means inside or inner. The middle muscular layer is called the myocardium. And the outermost layer is the epicardium. And all 3 of these layers are surrounded by that visceral pericardium that we talked about initially. All right. Now the thing about it, and we're going to switch over to our diagram in a second that we have. Oh, here we go. Try this side. There are some things that we need to identify in regard to the heart itself. We already identified that this is the right side of the heart, and we have the left side of the heart. The sides of the heart, or the various chambers of the heart, we have 2 different types of circulation that actually go on. One is called the pulmonary circuit, or pulmonary circulation. And what does pulmonary mean? Lungs, exactly. So when we're talking about the pulmonary circuit, or we're talking about pulmonary circulation, we're talking about the blood that's going to travel from the heart to the lungs, back to the heart. So then all of that occurs right there within the thoracic and the pleural cavities, right? Because it doesn't have that far to go, because the lungs are lateral to the heart. So from heart to lungs, lungs back to heart to lungs, lungs back to heart. That's the pulmonary circuit. But we also have what's referred to as the systemic circuit. So let me indicate pulmonary circulation from lungs to heart, back to lungs, etc. That's how that circuit works. But the systemic circuit is something different. The systemic circuit is responsible for taking the blood from the heart to the rest of, break the word down, pertaining to system, to the rest of the organs in the organism, or the rest of the organ systems in the organism. So the systemic circuit actually has to travel a lot further, you agree? Yeah, because it's one thing to have to be right there confined to the thoracic cavity, but it's something else if it has to go from the thoracic cavity all the way down to that big toe and then get all the way back to the thoracic cavity. So the systemic circuit provides circulation from the heart to the rest of the organ systems and back to the heart. Now, when we get ready to go over the diagram, we're going to identify different components of systemic as well as pulmonary circulation. But for right now, before we get to that, we've got to talk about the differences between the right and the left side of the heart. Remember back in, was it the urinary system that we talked about the renal artery and the renal vein? Did we talk about that there? Renal arteries, because renal means kidney, right? Because if you have renal failure, that means your kidneys are not working. But the renal artery and the renal veins, they were responsible. One was responsible for bringing oxygenated blood to the kidneys, right? And the other one was responsible for taking it after it had been cleaned up and getting it back to the heart. So arteries are responsible for taking what? Which direction? Oxygenated blood.
Back to.
Artery starts with A, takes blood away from the heart. So artery starts with A, therefore it takes oxygenated blood away from the heart. So if we can remember that, then we know that veins do the opposite, okay? So arteries carry blood that's high in oxygen content, and it takes it away from the heart. Artery starts with A, takes blood away. Veins take blood back to the heart. And if the arteries have the oxygenated blood, then that means that the veins have the deoxygenated blood. Well, the interesting thing about our heart is that one side of our heart will receive all of this deoxygenated blood, get it and have it go through the chambers that it needs to go through, and then it will shunt it directly to the pulmonary circuit that takes it to the lungs. Well, wait a minute, let's put a pin in it. Go back to the respiratory system. Remember we talked about the respiratory system? And we said that the alveoli were the sites of gas exchange. And remember all those capillaries that surrounded it? But then we looked at an artery and the vein that were different. They went against this red-blue rule. It was the pulmonary artery and pulmonary veins, right? And that's because the pulmonary arteries, even though it takes blood away from the heart, it's taking deoxygenated blood away from the heart to the lungs so that it can become oxygenated. That's what the lungs do, right? They help us with the oxygen to breathe. So once that blood gets to the lungs, it goes through that entire process. Remember, primary bronchial to secondary, tertiary, terminal. Then terminal went to respiratory. Respiratory went to the alveolar ducts. And then we finally got down to the capillaries that were the sites of gas exchange in the alveoli. Well, all of that goes on when it goes down, goes to the lungs. Once the lungs are ready, the lungs will take that blood back to the heart via the pulmonary veins. That's why we have the difference in the red and the blue. Because even though arteries are supposed to take oxygenated blood away from the heart, they do. But the pulmonary artery has to get it to the lungs in order for it to become oxygenated. Okay? The pulmonary veins will return that blood to the heart, but it's already been oxygenated. So for that reason, the pulmonary vein is blue and the pulmonary arteries are red. Now it makes sense, right? Because everything else is like, no, red is the artery oxygenated, blue is the vein deoxygenated, except for those two. They are the reverse. So when we look at it, the right side of the heart is part of the pulmonary circuit because we have the largest vein coming from the head and the neck and the largest vein coming from the lower extremities and taking all of that deoxygenated blood and putting it right here in the right atrium of the heart. Deoxygenated, bringing it from the head and neck, bringing it from the lower extremities, dumping it right here. That's why we're always trying to aspirate that right atrium to get all that blood out of there, right? All right, so all of this blood has to get to the lungs in order to become oxygenated. So the right side of the heart is the pulmonary circuit. The right side. So the right atrium and the right ventricle. The right side of the heart has the deoxygenated blood. So then it goes through the chambers, it goes through the cusp, it goes into the right ventricle. Right ventricle will then contract, force it to go to the lungs. When it gets to the lungs, lungs do their thing. They bring it back to the heart already oxygenated. The left side of the heart is the systemic circuit. Because now it has all that oxygenated blood. It's like, hey, I'm ready to send it to all the various organ systems that need it. You need oxygenated blood? I got it, about to bring it to you. Once it comes on this side, this chamber right here, the left ventricle of the heart, is the hardest working chamber of the heart. Because what it has to do is contract with enough force in order to force all of that oxygenated blood out of it, up through one of the largest arteries, or the largest artery that we have in our organ system, and take it to all of the various organs in the body. And sometimes that left atrium, or that left ventricle of the heart can work so hard that the walls of just that chamber get really, really thick. And they can get so thick, and when you get to pathology, we'll talk about this, but they can get so thick that it literally can squeeze the other chambers of the heart out of the way, because this one begins to expand and get so large. I mean, you think about it. The heart is a muscle. And whenever you work a muscle, and you continue to work a muscle, what does that muscle do? It's going to grow. It's going to get bigger. So if I'm working this one chamber so hard because it's using so much oxygen, or contracting with so much force, or there's some type of degenerative disease that I have, then it's going to work so much harder, and it's going to end up getting larger so that the other parts of the heart might actually and eventually fail. If you've ever heard of otherwise healthy athlete all of a sudden collapsing on the floor, dying on the court or something like that, happens to basketball players a lot. They'll be running up and down the court, phenomenal athlete, but sometimes you can work this muscle so hard that it fails. And that hypertrophy of the left ventricle, hypertrophy just means something gets larger. That hypertrophy of the left ventricle can lead to some type of cardiac event, and the person could potentially pass away. But I digress. We're going to get to all that in a minute. But I just wanted to point out that our heart actually works in tandem both sides, but one side is basically for the pulmonary circuit, while the other one is for the systemic circuit. All right, so now that we've laid a little bit of groundwork, let's identify some of these chambers. So I'm going to put this diagram up. Hopefully I can get this to work like I need it to, just right. That we need to keep in mind when we look at this diagram, because this is the diagram that we will see on any assessment that we have for the cardiovascular system. Higher. Because looking at this diagram right now, I'm looking at it from a standpoint of this being my right and this being my left, correct? But I always have to think anatomically. And so that I don't get confused, since I'm writing it on this sheet, I'm going to indicate that this side, anything I write down is left. And anything I write down over here is right. Okay? So if I write atrium, because obviously I have more than one atrium, I need to know which one is left and which is right. Because when it comes down to the quiz, and it says click on the number that indicates the left atrium, well, if I think that this side is my left side, then I'm going to get that answer wrong. So just always remember that we are thinking anatomically in regard to this diagram. All right, so since we have talked about the four chambers of the heart, the right atrium, the right ventricle, the left atrium, and the left ventricle, which number would correspond to pointing to the right atrium of the heart? Number 5. So let's write that in. And I'm just used to writing the word right, so I just put it up there. All right, which number will correspond to the right ventricle? 7. How about left atrium? 11. And how about left ventricle? 14. All right, we got that out of the way. Okay, so we've got those. Now, let me back this up a little bit just so that they can see for sure. I need a pencil. Maybe that'll do it. There we go. Okay. All right, what we are going to do now is actually identify how blood travels through the heart. There are a couple of things that we've already talked about, and we will identify them as we continue to go along. But we're going to actually identify where the blood goes through, how it travels. We're going to indicate the arrows in which direction that it goes. Even though you won't have to do this on your quiz, but it's good to know how all of this goes. All right, so we're going to extend number 8 a little further. We just kind of draw it all the way down. Just so that you know that it will continue in that direction. And since we're talking about the right atrium, this is the right atrium right here, we've already indicated the fact that this is the chamber that receives the most blood at any given time. We're going to show where it comes from. So from number 2, we receive the deoxygenated blood from the head and neck region. And through number 8, we also receive that deoxygenated blood coming up from the inferior portions of the rest of the body. It comes up behind the heart and will eventually dump into the right atrium of the heart as well. Number 2 and number 8 are the largest veins in the body. One is called the inferior vena cava, the other one is superior vena cava. Which one is inferior? Number 8 is the inferior vena cava.
I mean, yeah, 8. I know you're pointing at 20 because it's down here.
No. And so then that means number 2 would be the superior vena cava. Both of which bring that deoxygenated blood to the right atrium of the heart. All right, when the right atrium of the heart contracts, it forces the blood through this valve that has 3 cusps. Therefore, the name of that valve is the tricuspid valve, number 6. And this is the one where in the beginning of when I started talking to you, when we were looking at the dissection tool, where we showed the chordae tendidae, remember that? Well, what we're going to do inside of this right ventricle, inside of the right ventricle as well as the left ventricle, but we're only going to do it on one side to indicate what's going on. There are these little muscles that are called papillary muscles. The papillary muscles have very long cords attached to them. They're very fibrous, and they attach to the cusp of the valve. So what happens is when these muscles contract, they pull the cords that are attached to the flap that allow the flap to open unidirectionally. So literally, this is what happens. Let's just say the end of my elbow is the muscle. When the muscle contracts, and these are the cords attached to the flaps. When the muscle contracts, it pulls the cords that opens the flap. When the muscle relaxes, it closes back in place. So literally, it's this type of action. Now, there are some diseases that will cause the cusp to either flap back and forth like restaurant doors kind of do. There are some that will make the cusp hard and then it doesn't close completely and allows for backflow into that previous chamber. But we'll talk about that when you get to PAD. But ideally, when the muscles contract, it pulls the cords that are attached to the cusp to allow unidirectional blood flow. All right, so those are called chordae tendineae. And they are attached to the papillary muscles. And we'll go to the PowerPoint presentation. I'll show you where all that is. All right, so the right atrium contracts. It forces blood into the right ventricle. When the right ventricle then contracts, that blood is then forced up through number 23, and it will continue out through number 9 to go to the lungs. And also, it will continue out, kind of behind here, through number 3 to go to the lungs. Well, we said anything that's going to the lungs has to be called what? Pulmonary. Number 23 is what's called the pulmonary semilunar valve. So you can write pulmonary SL valve. And what the pulmonary semilunar valve is, it's just like what it sounds like. It's a semi-moon-shaped kind of valve that prevents the backflow of the blood that's being forced through it back into the right ventricle. Ideally, all of the chambers of the heart want that blood to go in one direction and one direction only. So the pulmonary semilunar valve will allow that blood to be forced up through it and forced out through number 9 and number 3. Number 9 would be the left pulmonary. Would it be the artery or vein, since it's taking the blood away from the heart? Artery. So 9 is the left pulmonary artery. Which makes number 3 what?
The right pulmonary.
The right pulmonary artery. Alright, so now we've gotten that blood that came from the head and neck, dumped into the right atrium, then forced into the right ventricle, contracted, forced up through the pulmonary semilunar valve that's in the pulmonary trunk, going out the pulmonary arteries to go to either the right or the left lung. It gets to the right and the left lung, gets oxygenated, comes back to the heart via number 10 and number 4. And it dumps into the left atrium. So if the pulmonary arteries took it away, then what is bringing it back to the heart?
The veins.
The pulmonary veins. So number 10 would be the left pulmonary veins. Bless you. And number 4 would be right pulmonary vein. Awesome. All right, so now we've got this oxygenated blood in the left atrium. Just like on the other side, we have another valve, but instead of having 3 cusps, it only has 2. What do you think the name of it might be? Bicuspid valve is number 12. This valve also has another name. It can be referred to as the mitral valve, M-I-T-R-A-L. All right. So that oxygenated blood comes back, the left atrium contracts, forces it into the left ventricle, which we already said is number 14. And because it's so awesome in its responsibility to force all that oxygenated blood, we're going to put an asterisk beside it just to remember that it's the hardest working chamber of the heart. Well, when the left ventricle contracts, it then forces that blood up through another valve that has a semilunar shape. But this time it's going to go behind the pulmonary trunk and up through the largest artery, which is number 1, the aorta. And since these valves are leading to the aorta, number 13 is the aortic semilunar valve. A-O-R-T-I-C-S-L for semilunar valve. All right, so now this is when it gets good, because the heart is like, all right, I've done my job. I have gotten that deoxygenated blood to the lungs. The lungs sent it back to me oxygenated. I have contracted that left ventricle, forced it behind the pulmonary trunk, and up through the aorta, which is the largest artery in the body. Now, it's just on the aorta to allow these different segments to break off to take that oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. So this is how it works. Goes up through number 16, travels through number 24, and out through 25. As it continues to travel, it goes up 17, goes up 18, then it comes down, comes behind the heart, continues inferiorly, and continues to travel inferiorly. And to give you a good analogy of what the aorta is like, because all of our vessels, with the exception of a couple, have a vein of the same name. Like, for example, we have a brachial artery. We got a brachial vein. We got a femoral artery. We got a femoral vein. And just like the largest artery, the aorta, also has an accompanying vein. It's not the aortic vein. We have the inferior and the superior vena cava, because they are the largest veins in the body. Well, if you can imagine riding on Interstate 64. 64 is like a main highway around here, right? And you can take 64 all the way to Charlottesville and beyond, okay? But as you're traveling north on 64, you're going to see exits like, okay, let's start down here. Indian River Road, what else do you see? Northview Avenue, Willoughby Spit, then you get to Hampton Settlers Landing, you get to J. Clyde Morris, Jefferson Avenue, you keep on going, you get to that Busch Gardens exit, you keep on going, you get to, I used to drive 64 when I was going back to college, and this was how I knew I was getting close to home, when I would see Croker Norge. Have y'all seen that one? I was like, I'm almost there. Croker Norge is an exit. As you continue on, there are a whole lot of different exits off of that main artery. That's why we call them the main arteries, Interstate 64, 264, because off of those main branches, we have a whole lot of different exits. Same thing with the aorta. The aorta has so many different, it's so important that it has different names according to where it passes. So as it comes up from the heart, it's called the ascending aorta. Then you notice number 21 is showing you a segment of it. That's called the arch of the aorta, or aortic arch. That's number 21. Arch of the aorta, or aortic arch. And then, as it makes its descent over here, we're just going to draw in an arrow just so we know, this is called descending aorta. And it continues to travel inferiorly behind the heart, and as long as it's above number 20, because number 20 separates the superior cavity from this lower cavity down here. What separates those two cavities? What separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic? The diaphragm is number 20. But as long as the aorta is above the diaphragm, it's called thoracic aorta. When it passes beyond the diaphragm, so number 15 is thoracic aorta. But when it passes beyond the diaphragm, what do you think its name is? Abdominal aorta. But as it's traveling wherever it is, be it the thoracic cavity or if it's in the abdominal or abdominal pelvic cavity, because once it passes into the abdominal cavity, it's just referred to as abdominal aorta. But all off of the aorta are different branches of arteries that are going to the various organs to give them oxygenated blood. There is a mesenteric artery. What do you think that's taking oxygenated blood to? How about the renal artery? We did that one. The kidneys. How about the hepatic artery? Where does that take in oxygenated blood? Liver. So back to mesenteric. At the head. We're still in the abdominal this cavity.
What is it again?
Mesenteric. I'll give you a hint. The jejunum, duodenum, and the ileum.
I know it's somewhere back here.
It's somewhere up here.
Is it the small intestine?
Small intestine. The mesentery, remember, holds all that together. The mesentery holds the jejunum together, so that's why we can't pull the jejunum up and it all separate. So the mesenteric artery will take that oxygenated blood to the mesentery. So all off of the aorta are these different branches that will take the oxygenated blood to the various organs. Once those organs do what they need to do with the blood, then they send it back. And what we don't have over here that will run right parallel to this abdominal aorta is the inferior vena cava. Because just as the kidneys get that blood, they clean it up, they send it back via the inferior vena cava, which is going to send it up here and eventually dump it right back into the heart. Because our circulatory system is a closed system. So it's going to go wherever it's supposed to go, get cleaned up how it's supposed to get cleaned up, and it's going to be sent right back to the heart. So that's how that works. But you notice at the top, off of the arch of the aorta, we've got some vessels that we need to identify. So let's extend these a little bit so we can get an idea of what's happening. So the blood is going to continue up this way, and then it's going to curve just like this. So if we have a right something, we're going to have a left something, okay? So given that, let's look here. Number 16 is responsible for making sure that blood goes to both the head and down the arm. Its name is brachiocephalic. 16, B-R-A-C-H-I-O-C-E-P-H-A-L-I-C. I'll spell it up here for you so you can see. The brachiocephalic artery sometimes is referred to as the innominate. I-N-N-O-M-I-N-A-T-E. They are the same vessel. Brachio means arm. Cephalad or cephalic, IC pertaining to head. And you might say, well, it don't look like that's going to the head and neck. Well, no, but it branches off to a vessel that will take blood to the head and a vessel that takes blood to the neck. Number 24 is that vessel that we are trying to raise in order to inject our cases. What is the name of that artery? The vein that runs along with it is called the jugular vein. What's the name of the artery? The carotid artery. That's it.
You said this like 55 minutes.
Yes. So number 24 is the right common carotid artery. So if this is the right common carotid and it's heading toward the head and neck, what do you think number 17 is? The left common carotid artery. That only leaves 25 and 18. And they are the same, it's just that one is right and one is left. And it runs below the clavicle. So this is the one that's eventually going to continue on and run down the arm. Because like we said, the cardiovascular system is closed, so it's not like one segment breaks off and then the next segment picks up. It just continues, and the name of the vessel changes according to the anatomical structures that it moves beyond. So then here would be the left below clavicle would be subclavian. Left subclavian. That's the left subclavian artery, and this one will be the right subclavian artery. Both of which have a vein of the same accompanying name. There's a left subclavian vein, there's a right subclavian vein. That's the easy thing about the arteries and veins and trying to learn them, is that they all have a vessel that has the same name. With the exception of a couple, and we'll talk about those.
It was a spider.
Oh, okay. All right, so now we have that whole thing filled out. Are there any that you can't see or that you need me to repeat to find out what it is? Randy, you need one?
I was trying to read the right. Is that subclavian?
Yeah, right subclavian artery is number 25. Any others that you need?
I think I messed up. I have put descending aorta.
Descending aorta is what we wrote in right here, where we show that arrow coming down.
Oh, okay.
This is just showing that portion, as soon as it makes that turn, once it's no longer the arch of the aorta, and these three vessels, the brachiocephalic, the left common carotid, and the left subclavian, once we move beyond there, we have descending aorta. And descending aorta actually continues behind the heart. And once it passes beyond, all of this is thoracic aorta, and once it passes beyond the diaphragm, then it's abdominal aorta. So you might be saying to yourself, my goodness, where is all of that? All of that is right in here. And I believe it's in here. Yes. If you go through and you print off another diagram, these are all the words already identified. You know, I think she put them up there. How did she put them up there? This is the word bank, and it gives you the number. So 1 through 25 that you have up there, these are the corresponding letters that go with the numbers if there's anything that you've missed. Any questions about the heart diagram before we move on? Okay. There is something else I want to show you in the PowerPoint so that you'll know where to go as far as the PowerPoints are concerned. If you click on, let's see, let's go back to here. Cardiovascular system. Edit something real quickly so that you have all this to display for you. All right, so when you look here, cardiovascular system, if you look at, I believe it's this one, just so I can show you, oh, we're going to talk about that next. Hold on. Put that one down. Yes. This is the PowerPoint that goes through the information that I was talking about, some of the general information that we wrote on the board. So if you're trying to shore up your notes in regard to that, this is what you need to refer to. Goes over cardiology, location size, the coverings that we talked about, the different layers. Layers can also be referred to as tunics. And we're going to identify the different tunics of the vessels in just a minute. The chambers of the heart here, the atria, the ventricles, the valves in between the two. The valves, here's the information about chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles and how they work. The semilunar valves, the pulmonary, as well as the aortic semilunar valve. Differences between arteries and veins. Major blood vessels are arteries. They have the oxygenated blood. Pulmonary arteries, it tells about where they go. The coronary arteries. The coronary arteries are those arteries that actually feed right into the myocardium of the heart. They actually supply the heart with its oxygenated blood. And then we also talked about the vessels, the veins, the superior and inferior vena cava being the largest veins, having the deoxygenated blood or low in our oxygen, and a coronary sinus. Remember, a sinus is a space. That's the space that those vessels pass through in order to make sure that that deoxygenated blood goes into the right atrium of the heart. Now, what we'll talk about next are the different types of blood vessels. We've already talked about arteries a little bit, but we'll get into these next bulleted items. But before we do, I want to say something about this PowerPoint in regard to, let's see, where to go. Yes, anatomical guides, linear guides, and anatomical limits. And the reason why I like to say something about these three is because when you are getting ready to embalm your case, you're going to have to figure out where the vessel is. And it can be, you can have an idea that the carotid artery is up here all day long, but if you don't have some type of guide or idea or where it starts and stops to help you figure it out, it might take you forever to find it. So that's why we use what are called linear guides, anatomical guides, and anatomical limits. Now, first thing I like to say about them all is that, let me see, I need to erase the board.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If somebody has like maybe a eating disorder, or people that they smoke for a really long time and they get that hole in their neck, do you do
Where a trach tube was put or something like that?
do you embalm in another section of the body, or you still do the neck?
No, I still use the same vascular system. Because that's into the trachea. Remember, the trachea is your windpipe, so that's kind of centralized. I can still make my incision over here because that's where that vessel is. Now, whether or not that vessel has been compromised is something else. And I might have to go to another site to inject if I don't get good distribution of my fluid. So that should not hinder my process unless there has been some type of damage to the vascular system. All right, so let's talk about the differences between a linear guide, an anatomical guide, and an anatomical limit. Now, this is the short and sweet version of it all. Now, when you go back and you look at the PowerPoint, then this will make a little bit better sense. As far as the PowerPoint will make a little bit better sense. But I like to give you okay, give it to me in real people terms way. Okay. So that's what we're doing. And then go back and look at the PowerPoint and say, okay, now I get it. A linear guide. What do you see in the word linear? Line. Okay. That's exactly what a linear guide is. That's when you have that person or that case on the table and you look at them and you kind of see an imaginary line as to where you think that vessel would be. So we all kind of have an idea where the carotid artery and the jugular vein are, right? It's kind of right here somewhere. So I would see that in, that imaginary line on my case. And that's exactly what a linear guide is. It's an imaginary line. Now, I don't have to put the rest. The PowerPoint will tell you an imaginary line that locates the underlying vessels beneath the surface of the, okay, whatever. It's an imaginary line because I see the word line in linear. All right, so once I see that imaginary line, then I have an idea as to where that vessel is. So I see the line. I make my incision next. Once I make my incision, I am looking for something that's going to give me a clue as to where that vessel is. I need some type of reference point. I need a guide. It's as if you were trying to tell somebody how to get to your house and you don't know the name of any streets, but you say, when you get to the corner store, turn left, okay? Because the corner store is that marking, it's that structure, it's that guide that's going to tell you, this is the point that I'm looking for to help me find where I'm trying to go. So the anatomical guide is that structure beneath the surface to tell you where the vessel is. Short and sweet. Structure beneath surface. That's all I need to know. Because we know from chapter 1, anatomy means structure. So, back to that carotid artery. All right, I saw my imaginary line. I made my incision. I'm beneath the surface. I'm looking for a structure. I keep on using my aneurysm hook to move the tissue out of the way. And then all of a sudden, what do I see? Bam! Sternocleidomastoid. What is that? This muscle right here, right? And what did we say from back in the chapter on muscles?
Biggest muscle in your neck.
It's not the biggest muscle, but it creates the widest part of our neck, and it's also used as the anatomical reference to locate the carotid arteries. So once I move all that tissue out of the way and I see this muscle, hey, that's my structure. So once then I have found my structure, then I know, hey, here it is. That vessel is deep to that muscle. It's beneath it. It's deep to the surface of wherever that muscle is. And it's along the medial border of it. So not only have I said it's underneath it, I've also said it's close to the middle. So my structure is going to help me. Then the last thing I need to know is where does it start and where does it stop? Just like the speed limit. That's the maximum speed that you can go, and there can also be a minimum speed. But the anatomical limit is where it starts and where it stops. So, because if I make my incision, and I can see that muscle all day long, I know it goes from about right here to right here. But if I'm looking way down here, somewhere around the 3rd or 4th rib, or I'm looking way back here near the occipital bone, I've gone too far. Because the limit is from the sternoclavicular articulation. All right, what was all that? Sterno, that kind of sounds like sternum. Clavicular, that sounds like clavicle. So where the clavicle and the sternum meet, and articulation is where two bones or two joints meet. To the, to the mastoid process of the temporal bone. Right there. So that's telling you it starts right around here, but it's going to end here. So if you're back here, you're too far. If you're way down here, you're too far. So that's why these three work in conjunction with one another to help us. First, we see that imaginary line, then we make our incision. We look for the structure beneath the surface to tell us where it is. Then once we find that structure, we figure out where it starts and stops. That's the long and short of anatomical guides and limits. So that when you go back and you actually look at the PowerPoint, because I'm not going to go over all of them, when you read through it, and it says an imaginary line, you're going to say, oh, linear guide. And then it gives you an example. Linear guide for the axillary artery through the center of the base of the axillary space and parallel to the long axis of the upper extremity when abducted. What? Well, what that means is this. Because the axillary artery is actually under our arm. So it's telling us through the center of the base of the axillary space being under the arm, parallel to the upper extremity, well, that's got to be this, when it's abducted. Does abduct mean away, or does it mean coming to, when it's away from? So you kind of make that imaginary line somewhere along there. But this is not an artery that we would typically try to raise. Why? Why? Look at what I got to do to get to it. I've got to take the arm of the deceased and have it out here, then have my injection, my arterial tube. So as I'm injecting this way, our circulatory system is closed, it'll go all the way through, and it will begin to fixate the tissue in this fashion. Well, I don't want that, because I need that arm to be able to stay down and not be up. So what I might want to do is raise the brachial artery instead, because the brachial artery is in the arm, but I don't have to have it abducted. All right, so that's the linear guide. So then how about the anatomical guide? Description and position on the body, yeah, we just already know that that's going to be that structure that tells us where it is. The anatomical guide for the axillary artery behind the medial border of the coracobrachialis muscle. Remember this one? Coracobrachialis? It was a muscle that helped move the what? The entire arm. So yeah, it tells you this is what you're looking for. You're looking for this structure, that muscle. Yeah. And then finally, the anatomical limit. In an anatomical limit, you're looking for two words. Begins or starts. And extends, or where it ends. Start and stop. So you might be saying, are we going to be quizzed on that too? And how? This is how. Because that's all that's in this PowerPoint. When you click on this sheet, Anatomical Guides and Limits, and you pull it up, it's going to show you some typical guides and limits for vessels that we use. We don't use them all sometimes because, like, for example, the facial artery. Would I want to use that one? Because that means I'm going to make an incision on the face. And I'm trying to use an incision that's going to be somewhere hidden. I prefer that. Sometimes I can't always get away from it, but I'm not going to make an incision on the face where it can very easily be seen. So some of these we don't use as much as others. Right and left common carotid, yeah, we kind of use those. Axillary, not as much. Brachial, yeah, sometimes we have to, especially if the person sustained some type of injury to the neck where they got cut in the neck and it severed that vessel, or if it was occluded and we just couldn't use it at all. Radial over, not as much. But if you're saying, well, Professor Jones, how are we going to remember all that? You don't have to remember all this. Because what I will do is provide information for, say, the femoral artery and say this. A line that is drawn through the center of the femoral triangle would be the anatomical guide and limit, or the anatomical guide, the anatomical limit, the linear guide for which of the following? Well, if I say a line through, the line is going to clue you immediately, right? Or if I say it begins and it ends, that should already tell you limit, where it started, where it stopped. Or if I say, here's line, begins, ends, below the knee. So I will give you that information. The popliteal is another vessel we won't try to use. Why? It's behind the knee. So if it's behind the knee, in order for me to get to it, either I'm going to have to flip the person over, which I know I'm not going to do, or I'm going to have to raise the leg and try to make my incision while the person's leg is on my shoulder. No. So some of these are just not the best choice. The femoral, oh yeah, because it's a very large vessel. In fact, there are some embalmers that would rather use the femoral than use the carotid. Why do you think that? Yes, it's easier to cover up. That's one thing, because then when you dress the person, you don't see that incision. Or it's also far away from the facial features, that if you have any swelling or distension, it won't swell these features first. You might get some swelling down here, but I'd rather be down there than all of a sudden I've got eyes, or I've got a protruding mouth, or I've got a lot of swelling in the neck. So there are some that would rather raise the femoral. So that's how these are used, but we need those in order to help us to locate those vessels. All right, so from there, on the sheet, it goes over the differences between the anatomical guides and limits. And it's actually listed here which ones you kind of need to know. But you know, like I said, I'm going to give you all of the written information. You are looking for, is it a line? And you should know where they're located. I mean, if I say through the femoral space or through the axillary space or below the clavicle, you know where these bony structures are, so it should give you a clue as to what vessel is being identified. All right, let me close this one out, because the last thing we need to identify are the parts of the circulatory system. This diagram right here is very good as far as knowing the vessels of the circulatory system. And like I said, this is for the leg, this is for the lower leg, here's for the arm. We've pretty much done the heart already. And so if you can see this this portion right here, this is that ascending aorta from up the heart, because we've got those 3 vessels, remember? So I think this is a left arm. So this would be brachiocephalic, right common carotid, right subclavian, since it's a left arm. If it was a right arm, then it would be in the other fashion. Everybody follow? Okay? So since this is a left arm, because here's the scapula, and then we're going this way, this will be brachiocephalic, left common carotid, brachiocephalic, left common. I can't even see what that is. Right here. Axillary, subclavian. Okay, so there we go. This is the common carotid. Okay, so this would be brachiocephalic here. And then we've got common carotid, subclavian all the way down. Wait a minute. Nope. That's the right arm. Is it right or is it left? I can't tell. Can y'all see from there? Because I can't see it.
Posterior view is what.
Yeah,
But wait a
it's
minute.
right arm.
It's a right arm.
right.
It is a right arm, because here I can see the anterior portion of the clavicle, because the clavicle will be behind. So this is just like we were saying. All right, so here we have brachiocephalic. This is left common carotid, left subclavian. This is right common carotid. This will be the subclavian becoming beneath the clavicle. Then as it travels inferiorly, here's axillary, and then it breaks off to brachial, and then radial and ulnar, and then we have digital. All of these have veins that will take blood in the opposite direction of the same name. So there's a digital artery, there's a radial artery, there's a digital vein, there's a radial vein, ulnar vein, so on and so forth, that go in the other direction. But before we get to that, because she's got it down, it's down here too, let's go to this PowerPoint that identifies the characteristics of arteries and veins. We've already said a couple of things about arteries, and I'm going to also send you, or I'll post it in the under the documents that you already have, a sheet that differentiates arteries and veins in a chart form where you can actually do that. But one of the things about arteries, it compares and contrasts the two. Arteries and veins have the same number of tunics. They all have 3 tunics. Tunica externa is the outermost, tunica media is the middle, and tunica interna is the innermost. And sometimes they can be referred to as intima or adventitia. The difference between arteries and veins, number 1, are the thicknesses of the tunics. In an artery, it has thicker layers. Arteries are also deep to veins, because if an artery is severed, think about what happens when the blood comes out. What does it do if an artery is severed? It continues to spurt out, because with every contraction of the heart, it's forcing the blood through the arterial system. Our venous system, or our veins, are reliant upon our arterial system, because it's a form of passive, well, our arterial system is active circulation. Every time the heart contracts, actively that blood is being forced through. But because our veins are working against gravity, they have to have valves in them, number 1, to keep blood from flowing in the opposite direction. And they are relying on that active circulation to continue on, so that passive circulation can occur. Because you know, if I'm behind you and and you're in a chair that has wheels on it, the faster I go and the harder I push you, the faster you'll move. And it's the same thing with our arterial system. The harder or the more active it is, then the better it's able to force that blood through our venous system. But if we have some type of condition that will cause it not to do that, then that blood that's in the venous system will be pulled down via the force of gravity. And that's where we get certain conditions like gangrene, other types of problems. Persons who are diabetic having problems with the vascular system. So there are a whole lot of different things that can occur. But for arteries, because they are so vital, they are deep or deeper in the tissue. They have thicker layers, even though they have the same number of layers as veins. And the lumen. The lumen is the opening of the artery. It's smaller than that of the lumen of a vein. A vein has a very large lumen. So for that reason, when we are making our incisions, we need to be very careful, because we will make an incision, but the vein is superficial. And if I rupture that vein, particularly that jugular vein that accompanies the carotid artery, once I rupture that vein, all the blood that's inside of it is all of a sudden going to be in my field of view and looking for that artery. And it's going to make it very difficult. So, veins are superficial, arteries are deep. Arteries have thicker tunics. Arteries have smaller lumens. And veins have valves. All right, that's that information. Something just a little bit smaller than the artery is called an arteriole, and we saw this in the respiratory system when we actually looked at the capillaries, because before it could become a capillary, it was an arteriole. But the capillaries are the sites of gas exchange in the circulatory system. We rely on the capillaries to allow the formaldehyde gas to pass through. Remember, we've talked about that as well. And collections of capillaries in a particular area is called an anastomosis. The anastomosis is what we really rely on, because I might have a big old artery, like the femoral artery, traveling down the center of the thigh, but that doesn't mean that the tissue lateral to it or the tissue medial to it is going to benefit from that big artery. No, it's going to have to get to the arterioles, and then the arterioles will take it to the capillaries that will allow that oxygenated blood or the formaldehyde gas to permeate the tissue and fixate it. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So, it's the anastomosis that will allow for collateral circulation, which is what I just described. Because an artery is only one vessel going down this particular part of my leg, but I got more than just that center area of my leg. I've got the lateral and the medial sides. All right. So as we continue on, there's information about veins, same thing, same number of tunics, same names, but they're thinner. Then the smaller version of a vein is called a venule. And then those venules will extend from the capillaries, as we saw in that diagram from the respiratory system. And this diagram right here, this is nothing on the one that we just did. But it kind of shows you the flow of the blood, once again. But the one we need to know is this one right here. Now, the last thing that I want to share with you is how to make sure you know which vessels come next in succession. On this particular diagram, okay, it's important to be able to know for your quiz what artery or vein comes next in succession. Because that's how we'll locate the vascular system. All right, so what do you mean by that? Well, this is what I mean. Coming up from the heart. We did the whole heart, so we've got that. But once we get to that, let's see, yeah, right subclavian, what comes next? From the right subclavian, then I have the axillary up under here. Then axillary, and over the humerus in the upper arm, we have the brachial. In the forearm, we have the radial and the ulna, because we remember that the radius is on the lateral side and the ulna is on the medial side. So we can put those both together. And then in the fingers, we have the digital, because these are our digits. All of these vessels have an accompanying vein of the same name. So, arteries on one side are taking blood away from the heart. Veins on the other side are taking blood back to the heart. This is important to remember. As long as you can recall this, from the right subclavian, I have the axillary, brachial, radial, ulnar, digital. Veins are the same name. If you were asked which artery would follow the subclavian artery, you would say the axillary. Which artery would follow the brachial artery? Radial ulnar. But if I said which vein would follow the brachial vein? Axillary. Everybody see that? Because you'll be given a multiple choice question, but this is imperative that you know. These here. But make sure you read carefully to determine whether you're asked about an artery that's taking the blood away from the heart, or if you're being asked about a vein that's taking it back toward the heart, because that's going to make the difference in your answer. And you can best believe that I'm going to have each one on either side. There's going to be one that's going to be clearly wrong, obviously. But if you don't recall that it's an artery or it's a vein, then that will confuse your answer. So from subclavian, we need to know axillary, brachial, radial, and ulnar, digital. Good to go. All I need to know is she asking for which artery comes next or which vein comes next.
It's pretty cool. Artery, vein.
That will work too. Artery, vein. I like it. All right, so these are the ones that you need to know for the arm. How about for the leg? Well, same deal. Because extending from that abdominal aorta, at some point it's got to split because we've got two legs, right? So where it bifurcates, we have what's called the external iliac. Remember talking about that? When we talked about psoas major and how we had to use psoas major as a reference, an anatomical guide to help us find the iliac. The external iliac, then we have to know femoral. After the femoral, we have the popliteal, which is behind the knee. From the popliteal, then we have the anterior, posterior, tibial, and fibula. Because remember, those are the two bones of the lower leg. And then we've got dorsalis pedis. All of which have a vein of the same name. And all we have to remember is that arteries will be taking it away from, and veins will be taking it back toward the heart. So if I ask which artery would be next in succession after the femoral, the popliteal. And if I said which vein would be in succession after the femoral, external iliac. But it's all contingent upon you knowing the order of the vessels. The only other thing that you need to know on that diagram, it talks about the circle of Willis. The circle of Willis is inside the brain, and the reason why we don't typically see the circle of Willis because the brain is most oftentimes still within the cranial cavity. But in cases of cranial autopsies, the brain has been removed. So that means that these vessels have been severed. We still have to inject the head, and as we inject the head, we'll notice that the fluid is going to come out of these holes because the vessels have been severed. That's when we use what are called hemostats. Hemostats look like scissors, but they got a flattened end, and when you clamp them together, they hold taut. So I will take my hemostat to clamp off these vessels so that at least that fluid can stay in for a bit of time, because we need it to be able to get to the capillaries so that the gas can permeate. Now, we don't want to clamp off and walk away, because what'll happen? Yeah, well, the pressure is going to build up inside of the tissues, which could cause distension. So I've got to watch it. But I do need that fluid to stay in for a bit of time because, I mean, it's the vehicle by which we get the gas to be able to be emitted. But we have the basilar artery, which is part of the circle of Willis, the internal carotid arteries, and then we have an anterior, middle, and cerebral arteries. And they do just that. They feed the blood different areas of oxygenated, feed the brain different areas of oxygenated blood. Either the front of the cerebrum, the middle of the cerebrum, or the posterior region of the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest hemisphere. When we get to the nervous system, we'll talk about that. But that's what the circle of Willis does. And the interesting thing is, anytime you see the word common, as we're talking about with the common carotid arteries, common will break into an internal of whatever it is and an external. There is a common iliac artery. The common iliac artery breaks into the external iliac that continues to travel down the leg and the internal iliac that will travel toward the reproductive organs. And also, if it breaks off into internal and external, you also have a right and a left. Just we have right common carotid artery. The right common carotid artery will then be the internal carotid artery, and it's the external carotid artery. In addition to that, there are a couple of vessels that we need to know just on GP. The great saphenous vein. Number one, there's no great saphenous artery. It does not have an accompanying artery. But it is the longest vein in the body. It runs all the way from our groin area down to our ankle. This is the one that they use sometimes in bypass surgeries. Also, other vessels that do not have an accompanying artery of the same name. The aorta. There's no accompanying aorta vein, no. The accompanying vessel for the aorta are the inferior and superior vena cava. And then one we've already talked about, the carotid arteries. There's no carotid vein. They are the jugular veins that accompany those vessels. And then you will notice right here, it says the basilar artery also connects to the base of the brain, but this is not the basilic vein of the arm. We have a basilic vein. There's no basilic artery, but there is a basilic vein, and it's the most medial vein that we have of the upper arm. And I believe there may be a picture of it in here. If there's not a picture in here, basilic vein, basilic vein. Yeah, there it is right there. Basilic vein. And it's a very medial vein. Right here. All right. Are there any questions? Well, the good thing about it is that I did record it, so I will post it so you can listen to it and look at it again if you like, if that would help. Let me turn it off now.